Now, the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, is going to tell the Labour conference a bit later today that justice is at the heart of all we do. But some campaigners will doubt this pledge, as there are very, very few prisoners, including killers Lucy Letby, Levi Belfield and, of course, Rose West, for whom life really does mean life.
Yes, despite being given a life sentence, many are later cleared for release by the parole board after serving their minimum term in prison. And that includes Joanne Tulip's killer. Now, her mum last week told us of her devastation when she heard that her daughter's killer is about to be freed.
I mean, it was just unbelievable when we got the decision that he's going to go straight out. I really fear for the safety of women. I believe it's the way his head is wired because he hasn't offended. Things haven't been reported.
So has the time come for a complete review, really, of our attitude towards parole and early release? Should life for murder really mean life? Well, Rob McKern sits on the parole board for England and Wales, and he makes those decisions. He believes that even people who've committed dreadful crimes can actually be rehabilitated, which he discusses in his new book, very interesting piece of work called Parole. But the former police officer, Chantelle Lunt, says that we should not be gambling with people's lives. It's interesting, isn't it, that when somebody's told by a judge that they are never going to be released after committing murder, that they are going to die in jail, and that's the kind of a guarantee, there's never really a public fuss. But so often when a killer gets paroled and is released early, there's a major row. What do you think, Rob, that tells us about public opinion and killers?
I think one of the problems is that there's been so little information about what the parole board does and how we make decisions. And these are unpopular decisions, regardless of what I decide. If I decide to release somebody, then understandably people can be upset about that, particularly victims of crime can worry about that because there's not been as much information about it. If I don't release, prisoners are unhappy because they haven't got a decision that they want to. And what we're really trying to do now is explain more about that decision-making. That's the whole point of why I got to write a book. That's the whole point of why there was a TV series. It's just trying to explain more about what we do and why we do it.
So you probably don't want to discuss this individual case, but it really struck viewers last week when Doreen Salisbury, who you just heard from, appeared on Good Morning Britain. Because many people can't believe if a young woman is murdered in a brutal, brutal murder, stabbed 60 times, the man responsible, Stephen Ling, is jailed for life back in 1998. Minimum term of 18 years, serves 27 years. If you've spent that long in prison for such a brutal crime, how do you persuade that young woman's mother that he is safe to be out on the streets? He's known nothing other than prison for 27 years. He hasn't had interactions with women, and yet he's going to be in the wider world, and she knows what he was capable of, even though it was almost 30 years ago. Well,
I wasn't involved in that particular case, but although you say people wouldn't have had interaction, actually people do, because lots of people go through an open prison first of all. They'll be spending time in the community.
That's as far as
he hasn't been to an open prison.
No. Maybe not, but lots of people do. And what I see, and what I would say is that I look at where is the evidence of change. So it doesn't automatically mean that once somebody's served a minimum term that they will be released by the parole board. What it means is that they have a right under the law to be considered for release, and that's what I do. And sometimes those people will be safe to be released and sometimes they won't. The eldest life sentence prisoner that I refused release on not so long ago was in his 90s, and he was still a risk, and I said no. And I've not released people as well, knowing that they would die in prison, and they have died.
Chantelle, do you think maybe in this country we should have, as they have in America, degrees of murder? So, I mean, you're here to say that you think all killers automatically should stay in jail until they die. But isn't there a difference between the kind of case that we're talking about there and, say, somebody who gets involved in a pub brawl, gets into a punch-up and kills somebody with maybe a single punch? It's murder, but should they stay in jail for the rest of their life?
Absolutely. We should have degrees of murder, and someone who, for instance, commits manslaughter offenders shouldn't face a life sentence. We need to look at each individual circumstances. But for the case that we're discussing here, where someone has committed a heinous act such as crimes against women and abuse against children, they present a clear danger to vulnerable communities. And not only have they taken a life, but then the families of such victims serve a life sentence. They're constantly in this anticipation of, will this offender be released? And they and victims are re-traumatised every time this offender appears before a parole board.
But is it just about the risk of reoffending that we should be looking at here? What about pure punishment, that some crimes are so wicked in themselves that even if the person concerned isn't capable of committing that kind of crime again, the fact that they committed that crime anyway is enough to have them banged up forever?
I think some crimes are so heinous, such as the ones we've discussed against women and children, that people should never be released again. And I think also we need to look at the deterrent effect of sentencing. And the average sentence for someone who is sentenced to life is 15 years. That's at the average for when they're released. Is that an adequate deterrent for the people who commit the most heinous crimes? Is that adequate in putting them off? Because people really do consider that when they are committing crimes. Oh, how long will I be in prison for? I'll be out in 15 years.
But although the minimum term actually is 30 years, if you take a knife to the scene of a murder now, the minimum term is 30 years.
That's for a knife crime.
It used to be 15 many years ago, but it's now, you're looking at a minimum period of 30. And life does mean life in some cases. You get whole life orders.
In some cases, but not all. The average is 15
but that's for the
years.
Only about 70 whole life sentences being served, and 7,500 murder cases where those criminals will be let out unless they do something wrong.
Exactly. So someone could commit an offence at 20 and they could be out at 35. They could go on to have children and a family. Meanwhile, a life has been taken and we have another family living a life sentence of missing the loved one and seeing this person out and released into the community.
Rob, I think some people might think, is the reason that we don't give more whole life sentences not just because you think, you know, there's always hope for everybody and you can rehabilitate someone, but we just don't have the room. We've just seen a whole load of prisoner releases, obviously for much, much lower level crimes, but crimes which have affected people and hurt people.
Well, the prison population is obviously quite high. Interestingly, it's been about at the same level as it is now since about 2010. But when we look at, in terms of rehabilitation, the criminal justice system is based on the premise of rehabilitation, that some people get to look and reform and change and to get another chance to build a different life for themselves. And I have to make that decision.
I was going to ask you, on what basis, though, can you make that decision? You're sitting in front of a killer, you and your panel, someone who's been convicted of a horrible murder, they're up for parole, and they tell you, with their eyes shining with truth, that they're better now, that they would never do this again and they know what they did was wrong. How do you know that they're telling you the truth?
Because I don't believe that. I look for independent evidence. So the starting point of every case I look at is, what did somebody do? What did the court say that they did? And then I look for the evidence all the way through their life. I'll start from the day they were born up until the point they're in front of me, looking at what it is that's gone on in their life, what led them to do the things that they did, what has happened in prison that might lead them to build a different life. And then I've got to predict the future. And to be fair, we do that pretty well.
And how often do you get it wrong? How many times in your career have you let somebody out and they've gone on to offend again?
Once. I've considered over 5,000 prisoners.
Was that
I've released
a murder?
probably 1,250. No, it wasn't. It was a robbery, and that was one in 12 years. The reoffending rate of the parole board is half of 1%. Okay. When you look at all of the prison population, 90% of the population is released automatically. Okay. The reoffending rate is a third.
Chantelle, last words.
Susanna, there are well-documented cases of people who've been released and 9 hours later have committed sexual assault, 9 days later have murdered people. So there's many, many cases where they've gotten it wrong. And also, as you have said, the prison system does not replicate society. There are no children there. There aren't women there in the way that there are women in society, and we cannot risk the safety of vulnerable people by releasing people back into the community to reoffend and cause terror in communities.
All right, thank you both very much indeed for coming in. Obviously, some of you are going to be affected by this directly because you've either been a victim of crime or somebody you love has. And if that's the case, then you can find advice and support at itv.com/helplines.
Yeah, Rob, and Chantelle, thank you both very much indeed. Rob McKeon, you have written this book, Parole, but you're also in this BBC Two documentary series. If people want to see how the Parole Board operates, it's tomorrow night.
Tomorrow,
isn't
BBC
it?
Two.
Yeah, interesting. Cool. Such an interesting insight.